and our hope to do some of that today. We're here today in partnership with the ICA Public Diplomacy Interest Group and the Public Diplomacy Council of America. Public Diplomacy Council of America is a nonprofit association of practitioners and scholars that promotes excellence in professional practice, academic study, and advocacy for public diplomacy. This is the first of several events that PDCA is organizing nationwide on the value and the importance of public diplomacy. Their intent is to be present and to raise this topic. Today's proceeding is being recorded and will be available on the ICA website. I want to thank the Public Diplomacy Interest Group, Public Diplomacy Council of America, and Syracuse University, my home institution, for their support, financial, logistical, and moral. We'll take financial support, but in a time like this, moral support is equally important. I also want to thank the Executive Director of ICA, Laura Sawyer, and our ICA Conference Planner and President-elect, Professor Tomas Hancic, for making this time and the special effort to allow us to address this issue. I would like to very briefly introduce our speakers today, and they will elaborate on their biographies and their experiences. We have with us today two very well-known public diplomacy scholars and longtime ICA members. On the screen above us, looming large, as he does in our field, is Professor Nicholas Cull of the University of Southern California, Anenberg School. He is joining us from London. To my extreme right, Professor Nadia Kaneva of the University of Denver, right here in town. Next on the right, we have, immediately to my right, sorry about that, is Professor and former Ambassador Cynthia Schneider of Georgetown University. And in the middle, Mr. Donald Bishop, a retired USIA diplomat, a member of the Public Diplomacy Council of America, and a distinguished instructor at the Marine Corps College in Quantico, Virginia. I am Steve Pike, professor at the Newhouse School at Syracuse University and director of Syracuse's master's program in public diplomacy and global coordination. I'm the co-chair of PDCA's academic study committee, and I will be your humble moderator today. Our task is to consider how we've seen public diplomacy work and how we can make the case persuasively that this is a tool countries ought to have and ought to be willing to pay for. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists today to just give a few initial thoughts, but this is going to be very much a discussion. Panelists are welcome to respond to each other or to ask each other questions about their experiences, and we will have some time for audience questions and discussion. To kick it off, I would like to start to my right with Professor Schneider and ask her to, first of all, say a little bit about your perspective, where you come from in the public diplomacy profession, but also to tell me, can you tell me about a time when you saw an international event, an international negotiation, some practice out there where it is clear that the use of the public diplomacy tools made the outcome better?
Many. You don't have time for all the examples I can give. So I'll try to restrict myself. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I have a slightly different background than most people. I was very fortunate to be appointed ambassador by President Clinton, but I came to that position from a background as an art historian. I had specialized in 17th century Dutch art and had been to the Netherlands many, many times, written books on Rembrandt, spoke the language, knew the history and culture. Foreign policy, not so much, but I'm an academic. We love to learn, and I learned a lot fast. But that does mean that I brought to my position a predisposition to using culture and valuing culture, and my experiences doing that convinced me even more that culture belongs at the center of diplomacy, not the periphery where it is usually found. Something that the great Nigerian playwright and Nobel Prize winner Wole Soyinka said at the one and only White House Conference on Cultural Diplomacy held in November 2000 has become sort of my mantra. Wole Soyinka talked about how culture tends to humanize while politics tends to demonize. In 2000, he was talking about the Middle East, something you could just move right into today and make the same statement. So what does that really mean, and what are the implications for diplomacy and foreign policy? Well, think about it. Every conflict begins with dehumanization. That's the start. You know, whether it's the Holocaust or the Gaza war or the war in Ukraine, it always starts with dehumanization. And I found on a much smaller and more intimate scale that culture, and specifically the shared experience of something cultural, something creative, a story, a narrative, the shared experience was something that could really build connections and, most importantly, build trust. And nothing happens in diplomacy without trust. And you really, I've written policy papers too, and I have a number for the Brookings Institution and other places. You don't build trust with a policy paper. I don't think you even necessarily convince people, because to really persuade people to bring them along with you, I believe, and this is backed by neurological research, you have to touch their emotions. And I discovered this as ambassador, and it led eventually to a very concrete result. Early on, I'll give you this example. Early on in my tenure, the movie, and this is how old I am and how long ago it was, the movie Saving Private Ryan came out. And this leads me to interject another thing I believe about effective public and cultural diplomacy. It should be creative, flexible, and opportunistic. I don't believe in sitting there in my office and saying, oh, I am going to do this, without kind of looking right or left to see if, does that make sense in that context? No, I just want to do it. I have my programming at the embassy I did based on things I saw when I was jogging. So Saving Private Ryan happens to be playing in the movie theaters. I had other friends who were ambassadors around Europe. They were having big receptions with 200 people. And I thought, what's the point of that? I'm just going to spend a lot of money. I'm not going to accomplish anything. I would like to use this movie as an opportunity to have a conversation. I didn't really know where it would lead. And actually, really stupidly, I didn't even see the movie in advance. I just had some kind of gut feeling that this would be a good idea. My protocol officer kept not scheduling this event. And I kept saying, where is the Saving Private Ryan dinner? Where is the Saving Private Ryan dinner? And finally, I said to her, you're never going to schedule that, are you? And she said, no, of course not. Because my idea was to go with the Dutch Joint Chiefs of Staffs and their spouses, along with my military staff and their spouses. The Dutch were all men, mine were mixed female and male officers and mixed female and male spouses. We'd all go together to see this film in the movie theater, and then we come back to the residence for dinner. And so my wonderful protocol officer, who luckily could always be very honest with me, said, no, you can't possibly do this. You can't go to the movie theater in the afternoon with these important people. No one's ever done that before, which also kind of became my mantra. So, the great thing when you're in charge, I did say, no, I really insist. And if it's a total catastrophe, you can say, I told you so. So we go, and it is a kind of funny sight of all these fancy people in the movie theater in the late afternoon on a weekday. We watch the film, we come back to the residence, sit around the table together over dinner. Now, at this point, you have to orchestrate the conversation. You can't just, sit down and eat. Otherwise, you'll only talk about the weather and your children. And in the Netherlands, this might surprise you, you also have to specifically call on the women, because despite what you might think about them being liberal and hip, all that stuff is for tourists. It's an extremely traditional society. So I made a point of asking the spouses, the Dutch spouses, to speak. Now, I didn't want to do a, New Yorker review of the film. I wanted to use it as a jumping off point to talk generally about What does it mean to be in the military? How do you feel about that? How do your neighbors feel about it? How do people look at you? What do you consider your role in society? And I asked this of the Dutch and the Americans. And because we were in that very special place, I call it the magic moment, after you've experienced a moving narrative, and it has to be, pretty well done, but after you've experienced a moving narrative, I believe, and I've seen this again and again, you are in a open, vulnerable state for a few hours. You're still living in that story. You're still thinking of those characters and feeling open about them. If you can generate a conversation then, as opposed to the next day, forget it, it would never happen. You can bring out things in people that you don't get in a normal conversation. And sure enough, we had really incredible sharing about people's deepest feelings about their lives and their role being in the military. We had husbands and wives saying to each other for the very first time whether or not they wanted their children to go into the military. I didn't really know that would happen, but it did. It just took off. And at the end of the dinner, what had been accomplished, and unlike the State Department likes you to say what you're going to do and did you do it and how, I really didn't know exactly what I was going to accomplish. But what I had accomplished was building very strong ties between myself and the top Dutch military officers, between my military officers and those same Dutch, not even counterparts, superiors. And I also had built a real relationship of trust with my own military staff. That was step one. And people talked about the Saving Private Ryan dinner for 3 years. People were constantly coming up to me saying, I heard about the Saving Private Ryan dinner. When I left, each of the branches of the military always gives a farewell to the American ambassador, no matter who it is. They all mentioned the Saving Private Ryan dinner. That was step one. Then I did other things like running in a half marathon in the sleet and rain, flying in an F-16 without throwing up. That's very important for the respect of my military staff, landing on an aircraft carrier, jogging every Sunday with the head of the Air Force. So other things to build human ties. This all came to a head when, in my last months there, we had all been instructed, all of the American ambassadors in Europe, that our top goal was to sell the Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35, already has a successor, but that's not my fault, to sell the F-35 to our host country. And so the person from the Pentagon was coming over to have the meeting with his counterpart, number 2 in the Pentagon, number 2 in the Dutch Ministry of Defense. Well, that guy, that Dutch guy, Henk van Hoof, happened to be someone I knew very well. He lived in a historic town. I had visited his town with my family. I'd given several speeches in his town, and we were good friends. I found out by talking to his American counterpart, John Hamre, that John Hamre loved more organ music. Now, why would I bother to find out what John Hamre liked to do when he's coming over to sell the Joint Strike Fighter? Very simple reason. People are human beings. And if you want something out of someone, you need to build some kind of human connection. Well, incredibly enough, Alkmaar, and I knew this because of Dutch art history, Alkmaar had one of the most beautiful 17th century organs in the country. So this is what I planned. I was not even present. When John Hamre landed in Amsterdam, Henk van Hoof went to pick him up, drove him to Alkmaar. That was already more time than they would have had in an in-office meeting. Gave him a private concert in this beautiful church with a beautiful organ, gave him a tour of this beautiful historic town, and a lovely lunch. And at the end of that experience, Henk van Hoof committed not only to purchasing a number of Joint Strike Fighters, but also bought into it. That is, the Dutch were also going to supply some parts, which we also wanted. And the Netherlands was the first country in Europe to do that. And for achieving that, my own military staff nominated me, and I received the highest civilian award that the Pentagon gives out, with a hilarious citation that basically said, whoever would have thought an art historian would be so good at selling weapons. But, you know, we are all human beings. I think that it's so obvious, but it's so often forgotten. And culture can so often be the way to reach people as human beings. It can also, and I'm going to wrap up with this, serve incredibly important purposes in preventing conflict and in recovering from conflict. One thing you might notice is extremists and authoritarians recognize the power of culture, much more, I would say, than most people do in the State Department. That's why they attack it. That's why the Taliban bans music. That's why the jihadists that invaded northern Mali destroyed the tombs of the saints in Timbuktu. They recognize that culture is the key to identity. And if you can strip people of their identity, then you can dominate them completely. That's why Donald Trump has taken over the Kennedy Center.
Thank you, Professor Schneider. Let me turn now to my good colleague, Don Bishop, with the same question. Sometime in your experience where you saw the value of it and it made the outcome better.
Well, that's a simple question, but let me enlarge it with some frames. Now, Steve Pike and I began our work in public diplomacy in the old U.S. Information Agency and now public diplomacy in the State Department. And in different times and different assignments, we focused on all the areas of public diplomacy practice: press and public affairs, exchanges, speakers and seminars, speech writing, publications of magazines and books, and so on. And I'm sure it's been the same for Steve as for I, that I came over the years to see public diplomacy work in a much larger frame. So one frame is to think of public diplomacy as soft power. But if it's soft power, then you're also arraying it with sharp power and hard power. Another frame is that public diplomacy is part of an important, even critical part of US power. State and military officers alike use an acronym, DIME. You probably heard it: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, as the instruments of US national power. Now, the US has great influence, global footprint, global leadership, and global concerns. But in different countries, there are different priorities. In some countries, different priorities, and so different US government actors have different influences. States' focus is on diplomacy, so commercial diplomacy, economic diplomacy, political diplomacy. For the Department of Defense and the geographic combatant commands, the focus is on national security and international security. And in other countries, the United States focuses on development. So you can get a clue to these priorities by who visits the country from the US government. Is it an assistant secretary of state? Then the focus is probably going to be on diplomacy. Is it a 4-star military commander? Then the focus is going to be on national security. Is it a development coordinator? Or, so at different times, in different places, perhaps all of these visitors come and all of these elements of national power are engaged. So for public diplomacy officers of the Foreign Service who focus on communication of policies, programs, and explaining American government society, gathering embassy, State Department, the military commands, and development agencies on the same page is key. Getting their communications aligned is important public diplomacy work. For me, this worked best in Bangladesh and Nigeria. The key is for the embassy to assert the initiative in public diplomacy and public diplomacy communication. Now, there are always differences between the way State Department looks at a country or a problem and the way the Department of Defense looks at the problem. And there are many more public affairs officers in the Department of Defense than there are in the State Department. There are divides everywhere between Washington and the field. And of course, Washington is focused on the president's priorities or perhaps the president's campaign promises, while the field is in touch with conditions in the foreign country and know the local conditions. And I observe that usually Washington's priorities win out in this natural tension between Washington and the field. So summing up this part, I've come to see public diplomacy in terms much larger than the practice, but see it as a key element of national power. And I'll talk about this later. It's a key expression of American values and goals in the world. Now, if I go through my career and think of the things that I'm most proud, look back on as accomplishments during my career, I can think of a few. One was facing the anti-American wind that gripped South Korea in the 1980s. Another was getting Taiwan to end the use of drift nets in their oceanic fishing in the North Pacific. And in doing so, to restoring the runs of salmon that coming up the rivers of the American Northwest to spawn. Participating to end child labor in the garment factories of Bangladesh is another something I feel good about that public diplomacy was able to do about in the career. And there, raising awareness of women and child trafficking. And it was public diplomacy that nudged the police into the first police raid into the red light districts of Dhaka in order to free some of the women from trafficking. In Nigeria, we had a number of military deployments in support of African regional goals, and nervous columnists were always willing to believe that every American aircraft that landed was the preview of an American plan to take over Nigeria. Also, public diplomacy was able to chop off we were able to kneecap the idea that it was Mossad that had planned the attacks against the towers on 9/11 rather than ISIS. So we can talk about any of these programs or accomplishments for public diplomacy as our session unfolds. Thanks.
I thank you very much. We do go back a long way. On my first day in the Foreign Service, Dawn was the coordinator of my entering class, and I am probably, along with the other 11 people in there, responsible for all the trauma you've experienced since that day. But it's been a long friendship. I really picked up on that point of there's a bit of tea leaf reading. I will come back to this because there's some mystery behind the veil of PD sometimes. That if you look at the visitor, it tells you the message, and that you can discern things by looking at this as an element of any nation's power and any nation's values. And I think that's very important signaling. With that in mind, I'd like to turn to my dear ICA colleague, Nadia Kaneva, and say, broaden the lens as much as you want, but times when you have seen the use of public diplomacy tools make the difference in a positive way.
Thank you, Steve, for inviting me to be part of this conversation, and thank you all for being here on the last day of the conference. So unlike my distinguished colleagues who have spoken so far, I come to this field from an academic perspective. I have not been a practicing public diplomacy officer. And as a researcher, my interest has been on a newer iteration of public diplomacy that has come to be known as nation branding. And in a nutshell, without having to define it, which is a difficult task because a lot of people don't actually agree on what the correct definition is. But in a nutshell, nation branding is a way of bringing some ideas from the private sector, from the business world, to the practice of trying to promote national image for various foreign policy reasons. And my specific approach to looking at this has been to approach it from a critical perspective. One of the things about bringing in marketing and branding concepts into public diplomacy is that it immediately shifts the practices that we're talking about onto the plane of short-term campaigns that are highly mediated and where the focus tends to be more on achieving visibility rather than on building relationships. And being that relationships and enduring relationships is the main theme of this panel, much of my career has been actually spent criticizing this overemphasis on short-term visibility versus really understanding the cultural, political, historical context of the different countries with which you may want to engage. Geographically, I focused a lot of my work on the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, who understandably were very eager to reinvent their national image and present themselves in a new light after 1989. And it's been such a long time since then now that it's really interesting to observe historically how that's evolved. But more recently, I have also been looking at how the country of Ukraine has been using nation branding in its effort to mobilize international support, but also to mobilize its domestic population in response to Russia's unprovoked aggression. So in terms of singling out a specific effort that I would call successful, I cannot really draw on personal practice as Cynthia and Dawn, but I'm also an educator. Here at the University of Denver, I direct a graduate certificate in public diplomacy and also a master's program in media and public communication. And from that point of view, one of the most successful public diplomacy initiatives of the US government in particular, in my mind, has been the longstanding Fulbright program, which unfortunately right now is in trouble. But I've had some of the most fascinating and enriching engagements, interactions with both colleagues who have come to the University of Denver as visiting Fulbright fellows and also students who have come to study in our programs. And for me, that's an outstanding example of cultural exchange, enrichment, building relationships that last for life, because many of these students, especially who spend a couple of years here and make friends and really see a whole different side of America than the one that maybe they've been seeing in social media and the movies and other mediated portrayals, those relationships really last for a lifetime. And I would really hope that the current and future governments reinvest in that program because it's incredibly valuable, in my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadia. And continuing the theme, I'm going to turn to our good colleague and friend, Nick Cull, and ask him, tell us a little bit about times when public diplomacy has made a positive difference.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I'm a historian, and I've sort of written many books about public diplomacy, and all of them include within them examples of public diplomacy making a difference. I would probably, in recent years, I would certainly go. That Nadia's already been talking about, and that is the incredible achievement of Ukraine. In fact, I think that Ukraine has shown us something of the context of public diplomacy, rather than thinking about soft power, which would have, or which in practice is seen as adding something, a bonus to the most successful countries. I think we need to talk about public diplomacy contributing to a form of security that I call reputational security, and that in 2014, when Ukraine had not really been conducting public diplomacy, it didn't have cultural diplomacy to explain its story. It wasn't even sure how to talk about its story internally. Bad things happened to the country, and there was no international outcry. But by 2022, something had changed. Ukraine had a Ukrainian Institute, which was very active in Western countries, talking about the country, telling its story, explaining the difference between Ukraine and Russia. And we could see, even before the full-scale Russian invasion of February, that opinion in the West towards Ukraine had changed. And once the invasion happened, suddenly 1,000 American companies announced they were withdrawing from Russia. Why? Because publics would object to them doing business in Russia. I see that as a great success for public diplomacy, and think that I'll be studying Ukrainian public diplomacy for the rest of my career. But I think we can also look at if you want a sort of an A/B test, you can look at all the places where Ukraine was not conducting public diplomacy, where the reputation of Russia, based on Soviet diplomacy in the global South in the Cold War era, was still, the impact was still felt. And you can see a very different interpretation of that struggle, and one which Ukraine is now struggling to make up for by many new public diplomacy initiatives in the global South. So I hope we will see new examples of success in that region. I mean, I have lots of smaller examples of where that go in line up with what Cynthia was saying, where an act of public diplomacy at the right moment won it. My favorite came during World War II, when a German experimental V-1 rocket, so one of the prototype intercontinental ballistic missiles, had crashed in Sweden, and the British badly wanted to examine this to work out if they could, what the capabilities of the rocket were at that stage, whether it would, how much damage it would do. But of course, Sweden, being neutral, didn't respond when the military attaché called asking for it. They didn't respond when the ambassador asked. And so somebody remembered that the foreign minister of Sweden really liked string quartets. So the British Council set up a concert for him, and some beautiful chamber music, after the concert in the taxi on the way back home, the foreign minister said, and that was such a beautiful evening in this golden zone that Cynthia spoke of. Is there anything I can do, a favor, something that you'd like? And the British Council director said, well, if you wouldn't mind, we rather would like one of that V1 rocket. And the rocket was provided. So that's a amazing example. Another country's successful public diplomacy, the Italians had been trying to get Dominican Republic to sign a extradition treaty for many years, and then an ambassador came along who thought he'd try public diplomacy around the heritage, the shared heritage of Italians and Dominicans, and the influence of Dominicans on the influence of Italians on Dominican society. And this included a comic book about the Italian diaspora in Dominica. And that really struck a chord such that it was possible to get, for the first time, this long awaited extradition treaty. Anyway, so lots of examples, but am I okay to leave it there? I wouldn't just take words from scholars. I think you can also ask the people who have attempted to change their societies. People like Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, people like Lech Walesa in Poland, and they talk about how important public diplomacy was in keeping their hopes of change alive, and particularly the public diplomacy that came over international broadcasting, both Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the broadcasting of BBC were also mentioned regularly by statesmen like those two, and how shocking it is to us to see those voices diminished, and in some cases, case of Voice of America, actually silenced in the world we live in right now.
Thank you. All right, here's where we go off into uncharted territory a little bit. Because I do have a second question I want to pose to everyone, but I'm struck by some things that all of you have said just now. Cynthia, at some point you said, I didn't know what I would accomplish, but I was going to do this movie thing anyway. And all of it came to a head, jogging, interacting later over the Joint Strike Fighter. And here was an art historian trying to sell warplanes. It couldn't have possibly known that that's where it was going to end up some years later.
No, but I did want to build a good relationship.
Don, you talked about, well, this is an expression of values at some point. We're just having this conversation. We want to show where we stand and perhaps understand where you stand. One of Nick's most important points in the analysis of public diplomacy is first start with listening. So we want to put that out there so we can start to understand different values that we have, a very important element of humanization. Nadia, you talked about the Fulbright program, relationships that last for life. Nobody knows where they're going to be 20 years down the road. And Nick, you just talked about after this concert, the guy comes up to his counterpart and says, so this has been a great evening. I love the music. Is there anything I can do for you? There's in all of these stories an element of the unexpected. There wasn't a specific agenda going in. I had no idea what this could get for me later. Is that important? Is that essential? Is that sense of, I don't know where this could lead, actually essential to the success of the undertaking? Does anybody want to say something about that?
I haven't been the one who said it. I don't think so. I'm not sure I would advocate doing things
Okay.
without any idea of where they're going. But I would advocate following your gut and looking to build relationships and connections. Those will always, I think, lead to something. I did do similar things with a more specific purpose. You know, for example, when the film Traffic came out, which was an independent film about drug trafficking it was a fiction film, but it looked at the whole chain from Mexican runners all the way up to the Wall Street user and dealer. And of course, with Michael Douglas as the head of the DEA with his daughter as a heroin addict, very realistic film. But it was done by Stephen Gagan. It was a very powerful film. And we were at kind of loggerheads with the Dutch around drug interdiction. First, there was the thing, it's so much easier now if you're the ambassador to the Netherlands, but then marijuana was not legal here and they were always beating us over the head about that. Why don't you make it legal? And more importantly and more significantly, the Dutch at that point were the leading exporters of ecstasy in the world, a combination of manufacturing it in the country and it passing through the Rotterdam port. And we were doing our best to help with this, but we had a serious problem, which was that the Dutch drug interdiction worked on a 9 to 5, Monday to Friday schedule. So if our drug people got intelligence that someone or shipment was coming through on the weekend or the evening, tough luck. This was, never going to work very well. And of course we said, gee, would you think about changing that? But we were making no progress at all. So I thought, let's try going to this movie together. Maybe that'll shake something up. And so we did the same thing with my drug enforcement people and the Ministry of Justice drug enforcement people. We went to see Traffic. We came back and talked about it afterwards. And really what that film did was impress on all of us the gravity of the problem and the difficulty of the problem. And everyone lost the chip on their shoulder. No one was defensive. And we were able to have the most constructive conversation that we'd ever been able to have without kind of finger pointing and without, I can't honestly remember if I made the specific request. I'm sure I alluded to this 9 to 5, Monday to Friday thing. And very shortly afterwards, they changed that policy. We also were told after this took a few more letters and a few more appeals, but we'd been trying for years to get American customs agents at the Rotterdam port. And they wouldn't let us do it. And they changed that policy and allowed several American customs agents to always be working there. And years later, I saw someone who was one of those agents and he recognized me as long after I was ambassador. And he said, "That's so incredible. How did you do that? We've been trying to do that for years." And, I said, well, I took them to the movies. But it is really this thing I talked about of a joint experience of a narrative that moves you, puts you in an open position where you are more able to have a more direct, more complete conversation than you might be otherwise. And it's not always a film. In Mali, this happens around music. If you want to build peace, you take everybody to a concert. It's different things in different places. You have to be attuned to what works where.
Thank you. So Nadia, you wanted to.
Yeah, thanks for bringing this up. So this is a question that comes up quite a bit when I teach public diplomacy, when we talk about effectiveness and measuring effectiveness and what are the right metrics and so on. How do we know if something is working? And in the academic community, we have certain ideas about how to evaluate social processes and social change and so on. But as you said, Steve, there's always the element of surprise, or what in social science is known as unintended effects, right? And so I think I agree with Cynthia. It's important to have objectives. It's important to recognize long-term what your goals are. And that's part of, foreign policy. But at the same time, I think it's also really important to be open to be influenced in the process. So, when Nick writes about listening, that's really important. But listening is not just hearing the other side in order to figure out a way how to undermine their position. Listening must entail also leaving yourself open to be transformed as part of the conversation. Otherwise, you are basically in a transactional exchange rather than in a collaborative exchange. And a recent example of how that played out that has to do with the situation in Ukraine that came to mind was the really controversial meeting between President Trump and Zelensky in the White House, which very clearly there wasn't a lot of listening going on either side of the conversation, right? And we could witness a true breakdown of communication. But just a few days later, there were photographs of those same two men sitting alone somewhere during the ceremonies for the Pope's funeral, having a very intense conversation one-on-one. And after that, we also saw some shifts in US government policy towards Ukraine and military aid and so on. And of course, I wasn't there to know what they were talking about, but it definitely seemed like a very different interaction was going on. And even if the foreign policy objectives may not have changed so much, the type of conversation that was happening, I would like to believe was quite different.
I appreciate the word concepts to fix on transactional, relational, collaborative. The negotiation is always transactional. We all know it's transactional. Both sides are aware of that. The other experience maybe just opens the door a little. It's like, yeah, I know you're going to come and ask me for something eventually, but for the moment, we're focused on something a little bit different, and it opens those other possibilities. I just want to check with Nick if he wanted to jump in on this issue.
Well, I agree with Nadia. And look, to switch to the elephant in the room every time public diplomacy is discussed, the openness of public diplomacy to listening is the big difference between public diplomacy and propaganda. There's propaganda listens to target. Public diplomacy listens to co-create, to learn, to draw together, and to be open to self-transformation. And the extent to which our public diplomacy is not open to self-transformation is the extent to which we may well be kidding ourselves, and we're actually talking about our propaganda with just a more democracy-friendly term being slapped on it. So I feel very strongly, as Nadia alluded to, that public diplomacy begins with listening, that the first duty of a public diplomat is to listen, and that listening is a complicated process. But we know that the propagandist doesn't listen, is just interested in getting to yes, is just interested in mobilizing consent or getting the propagandized person to surrender or to agree or to vote or to and is only interested in them up to that point of surrender. You can't imagine Goebbels coming into the Führer and saying that there were wonderful things that he needed to hear from Poland or Belgium or anywhere else. It was always about pushing those people in a particular direction, getting them to surrender. And public diplomacy is better than that and shouldn't be confused with that, even if I think sometimes lawmakers might think that that's what they're voting for, some kind of magic get your way medicine, rather than what it really is, in my experience, which is a mechanism of convergence.
Appreciate that. I want to, I'm keeping one eye on the clock, and I want to also just touch base with our audience here and see if anyone has a particular question that they would like to throw in here. I have some other ideas, but let's see what's, yes, please. You can just nice and loud. Ah. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Harriet Lee, and I'm from University of Hawaii at Manoa. So I just want to pose a question to the panelists about the extraordinary changes that's currently happening in our country. So you mentioned something about how some of the, iconic infrastructure that was supportive of the public diplomacy, things like Fulbright. I come from Hawaii. We have East-West Center that has done a tremendous job, and about 80% of their staff were being laid off. So these things are happening, and we see at the top of our country, the sort of dialogue, or the narrative coming from that is quite different than what it used to be. So I'd like to sort of get your feedback about, at this particular juncture, what do you see how public diplomacy is going to be affected by these changes, and what are some of the things that maybe you guys, suggestions that you might have about how we take this further so that we don't get completely detracted by all of these different things that are happening?
In some of our initial discussions, one of the things that we talked about was, so do we need to raise the question of, so what's going on in the US? And we figured, nope, somebody in the audience will. Thank you. Well, there it is, folks. We've got the question. So what's going on in America these days? Who'd like to go first? All right.
I'm not in the State Department anymore, so I don't know literally what people working in public diplomacy are doing, but I can just say that my heart goes out to them, because I think successful public and cultural diplomacy in the United States previously has been connected to values that, goodness knows, this country was never perfect. And in fact, one of the strongest aspects of public and cultural diplomacy was, in fact, looking at our faults. During the Cold War, we didn't persuade people that freedom of expression was great by lecturing them in seminars. We did by sending abroad artists, writers, thinkers who felt free to criticize the very government that was sending them. And instead of being imprisoned, as they would be in many of the countries where they went, they were put on a plane and sent somewhere else. And that's what showed people, wow, this is for real. They really mean it. President Trump has chosen a completely different kind of power. We've thrown around these terms: soft power, sharp power, smart power, whatever. Sharp power was a term that was coined by the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, about 15 years ago, to refer to when authoritarian regimes use tools usually associated with soft power, i.e. media, information, culture, broadcasting, things like that. And that seems to be what President Trump is doing. With the idea that if you apply a combination of hard power, trade sanctions, and sharp power, seriously constricting speech rather than encouraging it, and simply paying no attention at all to the traditional historical values that the United States has promoted, then that's how you exercise power. And I think we're seeing already that it doesn't pay to disrespect your allies, and it doesn't pay to try to bully people because, big surprise, we are no longer in the 1980s. Don't ask me why he seems to live in the 1980s, but he does. And doesn't recognize how interconnected the world is and how dependent we are on allies and not so much allies alike. And it's hard to imagine how ultimately this won't weaken the United States really severely, really severely. But I think this is a case where the soft power terminology is valuable because to me, the most important aspect of Joe Nye's definition of soft power was his emphasis on the two-way aspect of it, that you can't just say, I am now going to exercise soft power on you, and I'm going to send you movies and films and, whatever. No, you have to admire me for that to work, because it does involve the power of attraction and persuasion. And if you do not admire me, then no amount of flooding of the traditional tools and capacities of soft power are going to work.
Don, did you want
Gosh, we'd need the whole afternoon to answer your question thoroughly. So let me just focus on a small part of it. So I suppose one of my anxieties is that there has already damage to American international broadcasting. Now, there's a little debate over whether the Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, and so on, are they part of public diplomacy or not? I think all of us would agree they're part of the public diplomacy. They're part of sharp power. They're part of America's image and values in the world. So I worry, I'm anxious about the shrinking of that and the voluntary yielding of the broadcasting of news to denied areas of the world. And then just let me make one other reflection. Steve and I, going through foreign policy training, State Department officers would talk to us about the Foreign Service manner. So you're an American diplomat. Some of the manner is you're supposed to dress well, but another is you're supposed to be able to listen and not immediately react, in a sharp way to things you hear. I was surprised when I finally got to an embassy, the degree to which American diplomats have access to the highest levels of society. I mean, I've been in meetings with the premier of China that it would take, any big American corporation 6 months to arrange to have 15 minutes with the premier. But American diplomats can do that. Now, when you're meeting people from all walks of society, some of them are going to be pretty respectable, and some of them are going to be pretty learned, and and there are people who are not. And you're going to meet people who are rich people who are dissipated, for instance. And so you have to meet them all. You have to listen to them all. You don't need to punch back, on their opinions. The value of your conversation is to know what they're thinking, and then to judge whether that thinking is more or less widespread, so that you can share with those Washington people who got the big plan for America's going to do this or that, to say, I just realized that they have religious convictions that we've got to be careful about, or we might be able to make better headway if we deal with this or that opinion that you've encountered in those conversations. And all this requires a poker face, for you to be sort of calm and be listening and note-taking in your own mind. 'Cause you have to share these opinions, and your rejoinders at the moment need to be mild. You don't have to you just don't have to sit and take it, but you respond mildly because you may need to visit them again. You may need, you need to sustain the relationship. So, so at any rate, I just add that in these moments, I'm really taken with the movie example.
Yeah.
And this vulnerability of a few hours while people are still under the influence of the acting and the movie, that you can get that kind of frank opinion expressed. Some of them immediately favorable, some of them not. But you've got to be able to, setting up the situation so that you can hear that is very important. And then sharing what you've learned with your colleagues and with Washington.
I do remember that well. I really do. And it was always, if you want people to open up to you, you have to be open to them. You have to give them the space to do that. If you come at them aggressively or some other way, they won't. And then you have lost that opportunity.
Yeah.
I do remember this, Don. Nadia, please.
So Cynthia brought up Joseph Nye's definition of soft power. And one important aspect of that is that he emphasized that soft power is not something that's just unilaterally created by the state, right? And the role of civil society and non-state actors in creating this kind of admiration and attraction that a country hopes to enjoy. And so I think we need to broaden our view beyond what's happening at the State Department. And even if some of it is discouraging or distressing, we have to remember that there are a lot of other channels of engagement that are still available to us, including even this conference that welcomes people from all over the world and can be considered a kind of science diplomacy, if you will. But there are also a lot of nonprofit organizations, cultural organizations that continue to find ways to engage. And I think we need to find ways to support those organizations. One of the things that make a democratic society different from an authoritarian one is that people don't have to always agree with what the government is doing, and they can engage with the world in different ways, right? And now we also have the opportunity to even be citizen diplomats because of social media, because of easier access to travel, because of globalization. And so I think it's really important, especially for those of us who are scholars, who engage with students, who write for a public audience. It's important to remember, right? What are the values that about this country that we still believe in, and not limit public diplomacy just to what is happening in a particular, sector of the Department of State, or only what the president is saying, or only what the Secretary of State is saying, and to keep the conversation broader. In my mind, the sooner people start to kind of surrender to a centralized rhetoric that's imposed by a government, the faster you lose this diversity of opinion and really democratic values, which is what America stands for in the world.
Thank you.
Let me,
Please.
So there I am. I'm the country public affairs officer to China. Wow. It means me and the ambassador. We are we're the pivot. We're going to express American policy. We're going to achieve American goals. We're going to meet. This is crazy. This is hubristic, actually, except that it's me and I'm different. But at any rate, I was astonished when I was sitting at the desk learning about the sheer volume of American private and institutional transactions with China. So I'm out on a holiday up at a famous pagoda and walking as the president of my own college. So we have a chat and he says, well, come along with me while we sign the sister city agreement with Tsinghua University, which is China's MIT. And like, how come? Mr. President, why didn't you tell me? I'm in charge. Well, no, I'm not in charge. And so there are corporations, there are universities, all kinds of citizen groups.
Yeah.
And with variations, there are things going on in every country. For instance, in Nigeria, I was amazed by Rotary clubs. Rotary clubs united against polio, doing their important part. So I'm agreed that public diplomacy, yes, we practitioners, we government officers, think we're the critical element of this. But it's one of the great fine characteristics of American society that this is going on.
Could I jump on this point?
Of what Uncle Sam says.
Yeah, no, Nick, I want to come to you. Please come on.
Because I think it's really important to understand that historically, public diplomacy has not been the providence of the United States, that it grew out of citizen and private sector and philanthropic work. And organizations like the American Field Service, Institute for International Education, the Commonwealth Fund, which set up the most important network of scholarships to bring people from the British Commonwealth to the United States. These things were not part of US government policy. The US government came on the scene rather late in the day, in fact. And I think it's very important that we are not in lockstep at any point with the US government, and that people understand that at any time there are a lot of Americans who don't agree with the US government. This was a really important element of US public diplomacy during the Iraq War. And I think right now we need all kinds of American voices. People in the UK, where I am right now, are very impressed with No King's Day. Though we prefer to think of it as No Tyrant's Day, or King's Under the Law Day, as nobody noticed that it coincided with the 810th anniversary exactly of Magna Carta. Kings are okay if they're restrained, believe me. And the other thing to say is that the United States is not the only country practicing public diplomacy. And some people would say it isn't even a particularly, so I don't want to be rude, but there are many other positive examples of public diplomacy. Let me put it this way, and there are certainly some elements of public diplomacy that are run better by other countries. But I think the most important thing we have to move beyond when we talk about soft power is the big problem with soft power, and that is that the theory tends towards individual countries, that it separates countries and creates an artificial world where if somebody in Turkey decides to learn Italian rather than French, that's a defeat for the French and a victory for the Italians. It isn't. It shows a kind of victory for cosmopolitanism and an engagement with Western Europe and with democracies. And if you look at where the attacks are coming from, the attacks are being applied at a system-wide level. Reputation is being attacked at a system-wide level, and we need to help each other to respond right across our system. We can't just seek to winners and losers within a battle royale of international image. We have to be able to step back and think about what's good for the image of our way of life and help each other be as effective as we can be in our communication. And to be honest, this was part of how things worked during the Cold War. And I think we need to return to that. And soft power is not a helpful way of talking about a collective reputation. In fact, it heads in completely the wrong direction towards a world of total competition between national images.
I appreciate very much what you just said, Nick, because I know we have focused a lot, and the thrust of your question is, so what's going on with America? And recent actions by the government have caused an enormous amount of focus on what is going on over here. But we spend a lot of time in the public diplomacy interest group looking at how other nations, other societies, other cultures pick up similar tools and do different things with them. America has used them for one set of interests and purposes. Folks in Eastern Europe use them for a completely other set of different purposes because they have a different experience, different political, social, and the moment that they're in is just completely different because it is their moment. Eastern Europeans, folks in Asia, China uses it for different purposes, Japan, Korea, countries in Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, they all turn to the same tools and look at it for different purposes. We just seem to be at the moment taking up a lot of oxygen, and it's okay to have that conversation. But it goes kind of beyond that. I really am sensitive to Don's point that there's a lot more to the conversation than just the government. It seems at this moment that the government's behavior has created a situation where when Americans go abroad, they say, hey, it's lovely to see you. What on earth is going on in Washington? And that's kind of a really difficult question to when it's the first one.
I wanted to just talk about another example.
Yes.
Korea, South Korea, you mentioned, which I think is an incredible example of a very effective use of, I'm sorry, Nick, it seems to me it is soft power, but I don't particularly care what you want to call it. The government invested very heavily over a long period of time in culture of that country, and really government money, in contrast to this country. People think, when they're watching a TV show, that why did Washington want to send us Baywatch? Well, it didn't. Some distributor in Burbank sent you Baywatch, but people don't understand that because it doesn't work that way in other countries. But I think Korea is such a fascinating example of the intersection of public and private, and really building up all aspects of their culture, food, music, of course. I mean, think about it. The most popular music in the world is K-pop. It's really amazing. And I have to say, I think the Korean government representatives are so smart about it. They have an annual summer K-pop academy at the embassy in Washington, and tons of Americans apply. They all want to learn this. But I think it's really interesting to see what are some of the results of this recently. And this relates a little bit, Nick, to your Ukraine example. You remember recently the person who lost the Korean election refused to stand down. And it was really a very serious emergency. And, nobody said, well, this is a catastrophe. Korean democracy doesn't exist. The country's going to disappear as we know it. And what seemed to me to be happening is the world sort of waited and watched. And there was this, I thought it was so Korean, it was so polite. Will you please leave? Will your security forces please leave? And there were some demonstrations, but eventually he did leave. And the world didn't condemn them, I think, because they had a lot of credit, because everybody likes so many Korean things now.
Sure. Can I come back on that for two things? One is that, sure, soft power is great, but only 30 to 50 countries are ever measured for soft power. So what about if we have a soft power 30, what about the no power 170? Second thing is, yes, some countries have managed to excel through soft power, but I think, and your own work has shown this, we're better off when we're using cultural diplomacy for connection, not for hierarchy.
I don't
not
actually see it as.
elevate one above another, but rather to connect through culture. And this is a way of building collaboration. And without collaboration, without trust, we're not going to solve the problems that we face right now. So, and I think you've shown that in your work in Africa, bringing people together around culture in an area which has had too much hierarchy, has had too much, this country's culture is better than this country's. That's a dead-end street ultimately, isn't it?
I completely don't believe in measurement, so that's another conversation. I could care less about soft power 30-20. I agree with you. That's absurd. And it is about connection.
I think on the two statements of we're never going to solve problems without collaboration and who needs measurement? I think we're going to have to call time on those two mic drop lines. We are at time. I want to thank everyone, Nadia, Don, Cynthia, Nick. Thank you for being here today. To our audience, thank you for coming. And to the folks who helped us get this going at ICA, at the Public Diplomacy Interest Group, at PDCA, at Syracuse University, at Georgetown, at Denver, at USC, who have all pitched in some way. Thank you very much. This is an important dialogue. This is just the beginning. And I think we just need to keep having this conversation so that we focus on the value that this can have for all of us. Thank you very much and have a wonderful conference.